May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, my Lord, strength and Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. You may be seated. Let me begin by thanking Father Ethan and also the leaders of this church and parish and all of you for welcoming me so warmly into your midst. I come from a warm country, Sri Lanka, which is a tropical island, and I experienced that hospitality and warmth. This is the second time I'm here, and I experienced that, and I'm grateful to you and to God for that. I would like to draw your attention to the gospel reading that we heard just now. And we come across Jesus in a tight situation and how Jesus comes out of that tight situation. It is believed that there were 613 precepts in the laws of Moses, and there were many interpretations on the priority of the law of Moses. It was supposed to be the sum of 365 and 248. 365 is the number of days in a year, and 248 is believed to be the number of joints in the body. So by following those commands, you may be held together as a person all the days of the year. Wow. That was what they believed in. And Jesus is faced with the very tricky question. The second consecutive week we are reading Jesus trying to come out of a trap. Last week we read as to whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar. And Jesus came out by saying, give to God what belongs to God, and to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But his response was actually expanding the boundaries of religion, whereby he affirmed that everything belongs to God. He affirmed the fact that there's nothing that does not belong to God. And therefore he questions the dualistic understanding of state and church. Is there anything that does not belong to God? Even what we define as state, does it actually belong to us humans? Is the question that he asked of us in the meditation we had last week. So he pivots the trap question into a teaching on wholeness, on a holistic understanding of our faith. I realize that this congregation is meditating on stewardship. So what is our understanding on stewardship? Is there anything that does not belong to God? Is there anything that we can claim as our own? In our offertory prayer back in Sri Lanka, we say, all things come from God, and of your own we give you. All things come from God, and of your own do we give you. And in that understanding, our sense of giving comes with a spirituality that what we give to God actually already belongs to God. Whether it is our time, whether it is our energy, whether it is our talent, whether it is our money, it already belongs to God. It does not belong to me. It does not belong to you. And what we give is only symbolic of the fact that we acknowledge that it belongs to God. It is not a bribe to get something more from God. That is the Anglican or Episcopal ethos. So Jesus, we know, is now in a crucial stage in his ministry in Matthew. And he is now in Jerusalem. And over the last 2 months, we have been meditating on Jesus' teachings in Jerusalem. We came across many parables of Jesus where he tells the people very difficult truths through stories. And he was talking about God's kingdom, God's reign. And he is faced with the wrath of the religious leaders, the chief priests, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And we see that he is now facing his arrest and his crucifixion. So he is in a very, very tight situation. And in the passage we read this morning, we come across some characters. We come across Jesus, we come across the Pharisees, and there is mention of the Sadducees. So let me share some thoughts about these characters we encounter in today's gospel reading. Let's look at Jesus. As we heard this passage being read, as we look back on this passage, how do we picture Jesus? How do we imagine Jesus? Do we imagine Jesus as a loving person, as someone who is embracing and hugging children, as someone who is having a lamb on his shoulder? Or do we picture Jesus as this miracle performing human being, someone who preaches well, someone who is very smart, someone who is able to come out with witty arguments, someone who is instructing? Or do we picture Jesus, imagine Jesus as a person with a whip in his hand in the temple of Jerusalem, calling Herod a fox? There are many ways in which we can imagine Jesus. How do we see Jesus approaching God? How do we imagine Jesus approaching human beings? Whom or what does Jesus represent in today's context? If Jesus were to be here amongst us, how do we picture Jesus? Do we see Jesus standing for truth, for justice, for love and peace? Or do we imagine Jesus as a warmonger, a Jesus who promotes violence? Next, we come to the other characters, the Pharisees. And of course, the Sadducees are mentioned, and we see that they come together. They collaborate to work against Jesus. How do we picture them? How do we imagine them? Of course, we must guard against anti-Semitism, because Jesus was also a Jew. So we must not think that they are the bad people and all Jews are bad, because Jesus was also a Jew. We cannot forget that. But of course, we should remember that they represent something in all of us. Jesus was challenging their understanding of religion. Jesus was challenging their narrow-mindedness. Jesus was challenging their fragmentation of church and state, of God and neighbor. So how do we imagine them? What do they represent in today's world? Jesus was rejecting their fragmentation in favor of wholeness. So, do we imagine that the Pharisees represent fragmentation in our society? This passage traces the journey to wholeness as a movement of a solid foundation. And this solid foundation leads to consequences. What is this solid foundation? Jesus basically says that the foundation of religion, the foundation of our understanding of spirituality is giving first place to God. God, Jesus says, must be at the heart of our understanding of what religion is. And therefore he says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And when we do this, and when we have this as our foundation, the love of God, embracing God in all of who God is, all other things fall into place. Love for neighbor and love for ourselves. Let's see how God becoming the foundation helps us with our religion. Very often when we live in this busy world, we remember or we are reminded that we have so many things to do. We have so many commitments. And add to that, Father Ethan will tell you, you have commitments in church. And you were told this morning in how many other ways you can commit yourselves to this congregation. You can be a cross-bearer, you can be a acolyte, you can be a steward in many ways. So this is in addition to all your other commitments. So you might feel overwhelmed. And therefore, we might have this question, this dilemma as to what is most important in our lives. How do we prioritize all our commitments? We need to understand that anything is important only because they are linked to a basic obligation. And that, my dear friends, is our commitment to God. Everything in our lives has a center against our commitment to God. Therefore, we must ask ourselves, to whom or to what do we surrender our lives to? To whom or to what do we put our trust in? Whom do we choose to please more than any other? And if our answer to all this is that it is to God, that I give all my heart, all my soul, and all my mind, everything else in our lives will fall into place. And the real stress is all, which means in the concrete, more than any other person, more than any other institution, more than any other thing, more than any other cause. We put our whole being in God's hand. And when we do that, when we surrender ourselves to God, when we put our trust in God, when we choose to please God more than any other, all the other consequences will follow. The consequence of loving our neighbor, the consequence of loving ourselves. We live in a very fragmented society. The current culture, the Western culture, the capitalistic culture is very individualistic. And very often we are told that I or you are important. And individualism affects everything in our lives, including our relationships between individuals, between nations, between groups, between religions, between ethnicities. And sometimes it affects our life in our church as well. However, Jesus is rejecting individualism and upholds solidarity instead. And his position is that we and our neighbor are one person. There's an African saying, I am because you are. I am because you are. And Jesus seems to be affirming this. Our relationship to God and our relationship with our fellow human beings is what makes us love ourselves. And therefore, as this passage says, when we love our neighbor, we are loving ourselves. When we love God, we are loving ourselves because we love our neighbor. And this integration is the secret of wholeness. Neighbor and self become one. And therefore we choose to give ourselves to our spouse. We choose to give ourselves to our children. We choose to give ourselves to the community. We choose to give ourselves to the human family. How beautiful this is. Let me conclude with a story. There was an 8-year-old boy who had a younger sister. And this sister had leukemia. And she was dying. And this 8-year-old boy's parents explained to him that his sister needed blood transfusion. And that his blood was probably compatible with the sister. So they asked this young 8-year-old boy if his blood could be tested. Sure, he said. And the results showed that his blood would be a good match. Then they asked this boy if he would give his sister a pint of blood, that it could be her only chance of living. He said that he would like to think about it overnight. The next day he went to his parents and said that he was willing to donate his blood to his sister. So they took the 8-year-old boy to hospital, where he was put on a bed beside his sister, and both of them were hooked up with the IVs. And a nurse came and withdrew a point of blood from the boy, which was then put into his sister's IV. The boy lay on his bed in silence while the blood dripped into his sister. The doctor came over to see how the 8-year-old boy was doing. The boy opened his eyes and asked, "How soon will I start to die?" The little brother, thinking that giving his blood would mean he would die, nonetheless was willing to give his life to his sister so that she might live. My dear friends, this is the generosity that we take as our model in Jesus Christ. He was willing to die for us so that we may live. And this is that great love and compassion of God, who was not sparing his only Son so that we might live. And this is the great commandment in the gospel, to love with the same selfless compassion, with the same selfless care, and with the same completeness of God. May God enable us to continue to look at what our vocation is as individuals, as a community, as a family in this church, as parents, as leaders in our community, as ministers of the church, as we are involved in various ministries, so that we might love God and love neighbor. Amen.